Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Thank you for joining us for today's edition. We're going to start off with news coming out of the UK, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson has tested positive for coronavirus. Now, soon after he announced that he was positive for coronavirus, the health secretary, Matt Hancock, also said that he tested positive for coronavirus. And then, soon after that, the England Chief Medical Office, Chris Whitty, also announced that he was showing symptoms of coronavirus and that he was going into self-isolation as well. Now, this comes as Boris Johnson himself has also been criticized, at least in the early stages of the coronavirus outbreak in the UK, for his fairly slow response to the outbreak at that time, where he didn't even talk about social distancing or the like, saying that he himself was shaking hands with people, etc., at least at that early stage. And there has been some criticism about how seriously he took all of this. And this can, of course, be compared to some extent with Donald Trump in the U.S. also. Let's discuss that further. We're now joined by David Jeffery, who is a lecturer in British politics at the University of Liverpool. He's joining us from Liverpool itself. And joining us from Bournemouth in the UK is Jonathan Hines, who's a co-founder and presenter at UK Talk Radio and is formerly producer and presenter of Talk Solent on That's Solent TV. Jonathan and David, thank you both for your time today. Jonathan, what do you think about Boris Johnson's response so far to the coronavirus outbreak in the UK?
Recently, in the last week or so, very, very good. Very, very sincere, very thorough. But I don't think that politicians have been much different really from the general population. I think it's only in the last 7 days or less that the average person has really begun to fully understand just how fast this is spreading and how serious this is. Just in the last week, it's all happening so quickly, and even now there are still a minority of people that don't seem to understand that people are dying, and they're, for whatever reason, just not respecting the rules. So I think the government haven't been much different from the people, really. They just didn't really fully realize until very recently how fast this is happening and how bad this is getting. But I certainly think in the last couple of weeks the government's response has been very thorough, very well balanced, and it's a situation which is developing by the day. And of course, we've even got members of the royal family like Prince Charles who have also had coronavirus as well. So these really are odd times, to say the least.
Indeed. And I don't want to use Piers Morgan as somebody who has a lot of legitimacy in his criticisms of anybody, but he's also come out, Jonathan, and criticized Boris Johnson, just to the extent that, where he's tweeted that the fact that Britain's three most important people, and arguably the likes of Hancock and Whitty, as well as Johnson, would be certainly the frontline politicians, right, in this regard, in trying to defeat coronavirus. If all three of them can get coronavirus, that doesn't bode very well, does it, for the country's response?
No, this is very, very true, and very, very odd, as you say, as you hinted, that such prominent figures should be getting it, and it's also a very difficult balance because obviously we have to be positive, we have to not get over anxious, we just have to be sensible and aware, but sometimes people can maybe go too far one way or the other. They can become too optimistic or, a little bit blind or a little bit blasé.
Yeah.
Or people can be over anxious and paranoid, which you see, obviously we're human, so you see some people, they can go too much one way or the other, but you've got to try and find something in the middle. And I don't think a lot of people were fully aware until quite literally this past week. But I definitely think that the British government has handled this a lot better than, for example, the French government, because the French government didn't prepare France in time and didn't do the necessary preparations, and it's absolutely horrendous and catastrophic what's happened there, and their population is much more angry with their government than the British population is with the British government, because
okay. If you just allow me to come in, Jonathan, I wanted to go to David, who's now with us. David,
yes,
just tell us, what do you think, David, of the response so far by the British government when it comes to coronavirus? When you have a prime minister who, at least at the early stages, doesn't agree with the very basic advice of not shaking hands and that sort of social distancing from the get-go, what kind of example do you think that is set for the rest of the British population?
Well, I think, to the government's credit, it does seem to be shaped by the advice that it was getting from the experts. Early on, like your other speaker was just saying, everybody did seem to not be taking it as seriously as perhaps in hindsight we should have done. But at the same time, the advice that Boris has been, or the Prime Minister has been taking, has evolved, reflecting what the experts themselves have been saying. So the idea of a very quick instant shutdown was kind of demanded by a lot of people who were not experts, because they came from a place of fear, of scare of what might happen. But really, that wouldn't have been the best for the UK at that time. So it's quite easy to criticise politicians for what they haven't done in this global pandemic. But I think the UK is generally on the right track.
There's also been criticism of the fact that the Prime Minister's been able to be tested to begin with, right? And I'm sure you've heard of this criticism where frontline NHS staff, at least some of them, have not been able to be tested. Is that fair criticism as well? Because if you have your frontline workers, in this case, fighting this virus, head on, and they're not really being tested themselves, that just goes to show some form of, again, chaos?
Well, I think it's a difficult position to be in, because, obviously you want NHS staff who are at the front line being tested for obvious medical reasons, right? But there's a scarcity of tests at the moment. The whole world is rushing to buy them, and we're not sure that the tests that we have are as effective. So there's rumours that as many as 70% of the tests China's giving out to countries produce false positives. So, it's probably, how good are those tests anyway? But it's obvious why the Prime Minister of any country would be tested, right? Because you need to know if that individual has it, because they're speaking to the rest of the government on a day-to-day basis. They're speaking to the experts. They're speaking to all of the people who are coordinating the government's response, the country's response. Yeah. So if one individual in that group has it, it could be devastating for the chain of command in the UK. So, the idea that the Prime Minister shouldn't be tested is, I think, a bit silly. And it's also one of these things that kind of really only happens on Twitter. I think most people in the UK, in any country, would understand why the Prime Minister should be tested for coronavirus.
Yeah, but just before then going again, do you think it's odd at some level, David, that you would have the Prime Minister, then the Health Secretary, and then the Chief Medical Officer, all three of them in a row almost get coronavirus? That's odd, as I had put to Jonathan earlier, is it not?
I suppose it's a coincidence. I don't think it's odd in the sense that we know that this is a highly contagious virus. It will spread from individual. And if you think in the day-to-day, you think of the setup of the House of Commons, people until very recently were very close together. So these high-level politicians will be seeing lots of people in a given. It's bad luck, but I don't think it's odd in any real sense. It's a very contagious virus.
Okay, so Jonathan, look at the NHS staff, because I don't have any arguments with the fact that, of course, the Prime Minister of any country should be tested, because he or she would be leading the fight in their respective countries. So that goes for Boris Johnson, certainly. But then NHS staff, right? As I'd put to David, there is some criticism in that regard, and that does seem legitimate at some level, right? Where your frontline workers, those who are fighting this battle, quote unquote, should really be tested.
Yes. Well, and whilst I would very freely criticise politicians where it's due, I think the trouble is, because this has all happened so fast and it's developed so quickly, by the day, obviously the government have got a huge amount of work to do and so much catching up to do. They're not going to get it perfectly right, because they've just got to adapt so quickly. And find resources and infrastructure and money so quickly. It's almost like a wartime effort. So whilst I'll freely criticize politicians, at the same time we have to forgive, if they maybe don't get everything right and are a little bit behind. When
do you though think, Jonathan, just because we're short of time, so just under 30 seconds as a final comment, do you think that NHS staff are well equipped at this point to fight this virus?
I think they're getting better by the day, but it's in a very, very emotional, very stressful situation. I do believe we will get there, and it's getting better by the day, but no, they haven't been. But I like to think it is catching up, and it will get better as the days go on, and hopefully not too late.
Very well. We'll have to leave there as a final. I would appreciate both Jonathan and David for their time today. We've covered, of course, the fact that Boris Johnson has now coronavirus, as well as his Chief Medical Officer and Health Secretary as well. Chief Medical Officer not confirmed at this point, just showing symptoms. But the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, has confirmed that he does have coronavirus as well. A coincidence or odd? Was it because these men did not follow the initial advice that came out by pretty much everybody, even the WHO, about social distancing? Nevertheless, yes, as both of our guests said, this has caught everybody around the world sort of off guard. But at the same time, if you had the WHO making very clear guidelines, shouldn't these leaders, especially in developed countries, have followed this from the get-go just in case, just as a precautionary measure, especially as the leader of a country? And then one of the NHS staff, right? The tests, whether or not they're all working or not, I mean, that's an argument for another show possibly. But nevertheless, shouldn't NHS workers also have the same access to tests, considering they are the ones who are the front lines of this battle? If this is a wartime effort, as Jonathan there had mentioned, shouldn't they have access to this sort of thing? So they're not going around, God forbid, infecting anybody else, especially a patient who may have other underlying conditions which could, give them further risk of possibly even dying from such a virus. So this does all strike one as a bit chaotic response at this point in time, and not much different, I would say, possibly from even Donald Trump's response there in the US. I'll leave it for now. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Nicolas Maduro, who is at least one of the leaders of Venezuela at this point in time. He calls himself a legitimate leader of Venezuela at this time. But in a fairly rare criminal case against a foreign head of state, the U.S. Department of Justice has indicted Maduro and several of his top ministers for running essentially a narco or cocaine trafficking group, and they've called them the Cartel of the Suns. And they've even offered a reward of up to $15 million for the capture of Maduro, as well as those top ministers. This is at the same time that a retired Venezuelan army general has also been indicted alongside Nicolas Maduro, and he's surrendered now in Colombia. He's been taken in by the Drug Enforcement Administration agents. He's now in New York, apparently, for arraignment. His name is Cliver Alcala, if I'm saying that correctly. He's been an outspoken critic of Maduro for many years, but he did, of course, work with him at one point in time, and he's now charged with allegedly running a narco-terrorist conspiracy. That's an exact quote, with Maduro himself. All of this sounds very much like it's possibly out of a fiction book, doesn't it? But is it true, or is this just the U.S. playing politics, considering Maduro is, of course, an arch foe of the U.S. government as well? Let's discuss this a bit further. We're now joined by Ron Aledo, who is a former CIA intelligence analyst. He used to be with the U.S. Army and DHS officer. He's back from Iraq and is now in Miami. Also joining us from Caracas is Daniel Sierra, who is director of think tank Venezuela Idea Lab. Daniel and Ron, thank you both for your time this morning. Ron, let me start with you. As I said, this does sound like something out of a fiction book, a thriller, where you have the leader of Venezuela running a cocaine trafficking group. Does it make sense to you?
Yes, I mean, actually, that's something that we were expecting years ago. This kind of action from the United States, and it's something that we were expecting, and it comes now a little bit by surprise in the middle of the coronavirus crisis. But basically, what many people in the intelligence community, DEA, knew for years is that for many, many years, beginning with Chad.
All right, it seems we've gotten cut off there with Ron. Daniel, let me go to you then with that question. What are your thoughts about this case?
Well, picking up on what Ron was saying, I believe this was expected from several years. Dozens of reports confirming several allegations about the cartel of the Suns, as you have mentioned, have been out there on the media and several even indictments of several of the people that have been indicted yesterday have appeared on their own for several years. So it was expected that this was done eventually. But I do have to disagree with you that this is not a Trump's administration move. This is a Department of Justice move, which is an independent power inside the United States, and they do not play politics. They are independent from
but
the administration.
Do you not think, though, Daniel, at the very least, that the time is a bit odd, considering that we are in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, and Venezuela has also asked for, as we've spoken about previously, for economic sanctions against it to be lifted, so it's able to fight the coronavirus pandemic within its own borders. I mean, this does seem, at least as far as timing goes, very convenient, does it not?
But there are totally separated issues. This has nothing to do with sanctions. This is a criminal indictment to the leaders of a criminal ring. And I believe that if you read the indictment that was put out on the internet by the Department of Justice, you can see the details of the several actions that were taken by this group of people, and it's very compelling. And there is no reason to believe that the allegations that are there are not true.
Okay, so Ron is back with us. Tell us, what do you make of the role of, if I'm saying the name correctly, Cliver Alcala, who was a Venezuelan army general, but is now quite an outspoken critic, in fact, of Maduro? Why would he now be indicted, why is he now involved in this case? And do you really think that he was running this sort of, as the U.S. calls it, narco-terrorist conspiracy?
Well, I think that he's representative of what many generals did for many years, regardless if they are supporting now Maduro or they went into the opposition. For many years, military officers from the army and from the Guardia Nacional, that is like the Gendarmerie force of Venezuela, for many years they were supporting, protecting, giving free pass, giving logistics.
Daniel, let me go to you. What do you make of Cliver Alcala's role in all of this? And then I'm wondering if I can add a second question to you as well. What exactly benefit do you think Maduro would get by running such a trafficking group? Because, he is the leader technically of an oil-rich country. If this is a case which has been long-standing, or at least for a number of years, why would he turn to cocaine to try to make a buck?
Well, they have done this for several years, and as the indictment makes very clear, this is part of a broader conspiracy with the FARC group, which is the Colombian Communist Guerrilla Movement. And this is a conspiracy to use the Venezuelan state institutions and resources to provide help and material support to FARC in order for them to continue their armed struggle inside Colombia. So there is a point of enriching himself as a person and the different people that were indicted the other day, but there is also a broader general political conspiracy against the United States and in order to support FARC's internal armed struggle in Colombia. This has been the foreign policy explicitly for Hugo Chavez, that is also mentioned as a leader of this ring in the indictment, and then continued by Nicolás Maduro. So It is both using the state resources and enriching themselves personally.
Okay, so let's talk about the fact that, because it is, as you correctly pointed out, of course, Daniel, the Department of Justice of the United States has brought forth these charges. What kind of teeth do they have to really hold Maduro to account? I mean, the government that this Department of Justice works under has already placed fairly heavy sanctions upon the Maduro government, as well as his abilities and activities around the world. Can this government, i.e. the Trump administration or the Department of Justice, really bring him to account?
Sure. So the Department of Justice enacted a reward of $15 million for the arrest of Nicolas Maduro and $10 million for the arrest of several of his aides in this narco criminal conspiracy. I believe that is answering your question. The truth that the Department of Justice is trying to bring up to the table in terms of a reward for people that can help lead to their arrest.
But then, what do you make of the political optics of all this, right? Because this is a sovereign country, Venezuela, right? Which, yes, is going through major political chaos at this point in time, where we have the Maduro versus Guaido parallel governments essentially existing side by side. Some countries accept Guaido, some countries accept Maduro. I don't want to get into that argument specifically, but in such a chaotic situation, does the U.S. government, which is not part of the Venezuelan government, have the sovereign authority, do you think, to hold Maduro to account?
Waqar, it's a very sad situation, and we have to start with that. It's very sad that the Republic of Venezuela was hijacked by a criminal ring, and the resources of the state have been kidnapped by this group in order to help their private interests. So I agree with you that the optics of this are very sad. The Venezuelan people are suffering because of this. This has been in the making for several years, and I believe the international community is going to need to help Venezuelans reconstruct their country after this terrible, terrible experience that we have lived through, of living for several years under the de facto control of a narco terrorist ring that hijacked the state institution.
Okay, we're just joined now by Cardenas Lema, who is the editor of the independent media Joven Cuba, and he's also a master in international relations at Columbia University. He's joining us now from Maryland in the U.S. Harold, thank you for your time this morning. We're just short of time, Harold, so I'm going to ask you one final question before letting all of you go. What do you make of this case against Maduro, as well as Cliver Alcala? Do you think that what do you think, let me put it this way, will be the effect from within Venezuela itself, where we already have, major economic problems, and then now a coronavirus pandemic on top of that?
Thank you, Mr. Rizvi. Yes, I think the Trump administration is running out of options, and this was the next logical move to do. The Guaido support has stagnated domestically. The Venezuelan government has managed to normalize the situation in the last year. Despite the promises to Trump of having a quick win in Venezuela, John Bolton's policy of maximum pressure is not working. So obviously they need to change something. Venezuela usually is such a polarizing topic that it's hard to separate propaganda from facts. So we have to be very careful when we talk about the country. But we do know this. There is drug trafficking. The drug trafficking in Venezuela has certainly increased. Implementing the rule of law in a sanctioning country is much harder than in any other country. And Venezuela has a record on political corruption that goes way beyond the Maduro or the Chavez administration. We should definitely demand accountability for this government, but also to put things in context.
Okay, so Harold, I have time for just one more question with you. If this is, if this case goes through, right, where we have possibly somebody who will take up this offer of trying to capture Maduro for that reward of $15 million, what does that then mean about the sovereignty of Venezuela at this point in time, where a foreign government, whether it supports Maduro or not, that's a separate argument for a separate show. I don't want to get into the Guaido versus Maduro argument, but just on the basis of sovereignty of Venezuela, does the U.S. have the right to do what it says it's doing?
Yeah, definitely there is a sovereignty issue to be talked about here. I think the U.S. keeps betting on partisan solutions, and instead of promoting the dialogue and trying to find a negotiated solution out of this problem and out of this crisis that the country has, that actually puts everybody in the table and tries to make something with everybody together, is trying to practically make the opposition win. And the opposition can win, but you still have many Chavistas that you have to deal with after that. So I think that that's not really helpful. And also, there is a humanitarian point to be made on this. Despite the coronavirus crisis, the U.S. is not easing the sanctions against Venezuela. And I think that's also a topic that we should be asking about. Why is this the best moment to increase pressure on a country when the population is on the brink of a humanitarian crisis? I'm not sure about that.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final. And as Harold there said, this is a very polarizing topic, so I know we've just touched the tip of the iceberg, but I'll appreciate all three of my guests who have joined us to talk about this, Harold, Daniel, and Ron, for taking their time out this morning to speak to us here in Scope. This is complicated because, okay, if this is a case, as has been laid out by the Department of Justice of the United States, and arguably, we can say it's an independent body, so it's not meant to, at least, be under the influence of Donald Trump specifically, or the White House. Whether that is the truth or not, that's obviously up for argument and possibly something that we should discuss in a later show. But if this case is something that's been building up since even the Chavez years, why now? I still find the timing a bit odd, especially at a time when Venezuela has been under economic sanctions for a while now, ever since Guaido came on the scene and declared himself as the legitimate president. Of course, some countries do accept him as a legitimate president, others do not. That is a chaos in and of itself, and political crises which has really hurt the country and its economy, as well as its people who have sought shelter and better economic opportunities elsewhere in Latin America or even in the US, some of them. Does throwing this into the mix really help? Or is it, as Daniel there said, completely independent of all of that, and that Maduro must be held to account for this if he is proven to be involved in this? And then to Clive Alcala's role in this, an ex-military general of the Venezuelan army who was once aligned with Maduro, now is a critic of Maduro. He's now part of this narco-terrorist conspiracy, as the U.S. says. It may very well be true, but as I said in my introduction, it seems very much like a thriller novel almost. Sure, there's drug trafficking in Venezuela, which has increased because people need to make money. But then again, this is an oil-rich country. Couldn't Maduro have made money other ways, or even Chavez, through corruption in just oil? Why would they need to turn to cocaine necessarily? A lot of questions, of course, remain unanswered, and hopefully they'll get answered through this case if it goes through to a court. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. In this last segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the U.S. and its apparent appeal to allies for help regarding, of course, its fight against the coronavirus pandemic, which we know is growing fairly exponentially within the borders of the United States at this point in time. And there are two separate reports coming out, right? Donald Trump publicly says that he doesn't need the help of other governments around the world. He's made this, again, somewhat of an ego issue, as is completely his style, really. But then apparently secretly behind the scenes, he's been asking allies for help vis-a-vis the supply of ventilators or masks or tests otherwise, because they are all in shortage within the United States. As we know, the governor of New York has many times pointed that out, that at least within his state, there's a major shortage of ventilators and testing equipment, etc. Now, these are reports, of course, coming out from throughout the United States also. But then there's also then Donald Trump, who has now come out and said, ever since Boris Johnson of the UK has tested positive for coronavirus, that Johnson asked him for U.S. help in providing equipment and masks and gloves and otherwise. And he's then gone on to say that the likes of Italy have also asked him, and Spain and Germany, that they all want America to provide them, respectively, ventilators. Who's right in this regard? Now, normally, of course, it's normal for any country, even the superpower of the world, to ask for help in such circumstances, because these are circumstances no one could have really foreseen at this level. But because Trump has made this an ego issue, it's sort of become an issue, hasn't it? Where it's important sort of to try to figure out who's really telling the truth in all this. Let's discuss this further. We're now joined by Barbara Benitez, who is a journalist and assistant professor at the George Washington University's School of Media and Public Affairs. She's joining us from D.C. Also joining us from D.C. is Jim Williams, who's a 7-time Emmy Award-winning journalist. He's Washington Bureau Chief at LJC Media and Genesis Communications. Jim and Barbara, thank you both for your time this morning. Barbara, let me start with you. What do you make of any appeal from the U.S. towards its allies for help in defeating coronavirus? As I said, in any normal day, I imagine that wouldn't be a big deal, but coronavirus under Trump is unique, isn't it, where Trump has also made it a bit of an ego issue?
Well, that's right. And as you mentioned, one of the things that we're seeing is his having to go back to allies that he's previously insulted, if you will. For example, China. He tweeted yesterday on Friday that he had a conversation with President Xi. However, as we all know, prior to this conversation, he had been purposely calling this the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, much to the dismay of some of the community of China, as well as some of the community in America.
Indeed, and that's a really good point, isn't it? Where Donald Trump is sort of has egg on his face, doesn't he, publicly now?
Again, yes. Seems as if his message, Barbara's right. I mean, he basically has a tendency of getting in his own way here. There's reports this morning out that he told Vice President Pence, who is in charge, running this for him, not to return phone calls to states from governors who were not appreciative, quote unquote, of what he did. So this is kind of on brand, if you will, for President Trump.
So then what is it, Barbara, do you think, for the fight against coronavirus within U.S. borders, firstly, and then globally? Because if you have Trump, who has made this an issue of what his public image will be at this point in time, I imagine the public is just looking for somebody who is genuinely doing everything in his power to try to defeat the virus.
If you're talking about public opinion in the U.S., I mean, it's definitely mixed. On the one hand, there's half, if not more, a bit more, that think he wasted precious time, especially in reaching out to the international community. He's an isolationist. He's a go-it-alone, as we all know. So for him to now be reaching out again, he reached out also to the South Koreans, where prior to the coronavirus outbreak, he was going to charge them more to have the base. So my opinion, and why he's doing this quietly, I should say, is that because of wanting to save face, on the one hand, he wants to look like he's in control, he's in charge, but yet on the other hand, he's quietly having to use the word strongly, use the word grovel back to some of the people he insulted. How does that make him appear?
Indeed. And Jim, do you think that anybody would judge him badly for just being a bit vulnerable at this time? I mean, as I said in my introduction, these are unforeseen circumstances to a large extent, right? So for him to ask for help even publicly, I mean, personally, that doesn't reflect badly on him, right? Why doesn't he just come out and admit it?
No, your point is well taken. If you look back in history, right, we the United States, has always works globally to try to solve issues, right? You work with your partners. That's why you have partners. That's why you have, good relationships with other countries so that you can work with each other to solve, major problems. However, President Trump sees this as a weakness, and he doesn't want it to look like the United States has to, work with other countries to get things that basically he feels we are the greatest. We've got the greatest medical system. We got the greatest supply system. We can get these things to you. We can get these millions of masks out. He continues to put a happy face on something, which is not happy, and we all need help. So whether it's the United States needing help from its European allies or its allies from the Far East, he feels that's a weakness if he has to ask, and that is inherently a problem he's had all the way down the line on all his foreign policy issues.
Barbara, even I know doctors personally who are having a hard time on the front line, even within the U.S. I mean, I heard of just one last night in Michigan who was having a very hard time just finding basic protective equipment while dealing with patients of coronavirus. What does that mean for the U.S. and going forward? Because we haven't even hit the peak yet, have we?
No, that's right. We haven't hit the peak at all. And that's one of the huge issues and one of the criticisms of those that are critical of the president, if you will. We've had weeks. We saw this coming from China, then it went to Italy. Italy was supposed to be the warning for us that we could be overrun, that we need to prepare. And it's only now that we're hearing numbers that the U.S. has surpassed other countries in cases that have been confirmed, that he really seems to be stepping up. I mean, it was just yesterday that he really moved the Defense Production Act into place, which he had mentioned possibly moving into place earlier in the week. So why all the wasted time?
Indeed. And then, do you think that now that seemingly Donald Trump has his egg on his face and probably, I'm hoping, understands the seriousness of the situation, that we're going to finally see the entire power of the U.S. government going after this property and giving the proper supplies to those on the front lines, be it protective equipment, ventilators, otherwise?
Let's hope, okay? Let's also hope that General Motors can build ventilators. I mean, not just, when you're building medical supplies, right? They can build cars. There's no question about it. And like in World War II, Ford built a number of airplanes that went off and helped win the war. So yes, these major corporations can do it. We just need to get them the proper plans to make it work. And let's hope that we can all rally together, both here in the United States and with our allies, to defeat the COVID-19 virus. I mean, it's important that we work together at these times. And I think that, people on the sidelines have been waiting. These corporations have been waiting. They've told the president, tell us what you want to do. We'll do it. But it took the War Powers Act to get it done, only because that's what it's supposed to do.
All right, Barbara, I'll give you the final word before I let you both go. I imagine these sorts of crises define a president's legacy, do they not? How do you think Donald Trump will be remembered?
Well, that's a great question, because on the one hand, as I mentioned before, you have, there was a poll that came out yesterday, actually, that was taken, that's supposed to be quite reputable, and it said that, 50% of America feel he's handling it well. However, on the one hand, he'll do something to handle it well that maybe will raise his ranks in public opinion, but then he'll turn around and say something on the pettier side, which he's also known to do. So it's really going to depend. I honestly believe that however this plays out, and at the end, I think he'll always be looked at as a president who delayed in getting the essential needs to the medical staffs, to start the Defense Production Act, that he just kind of was worried more first about the stock exchange, the money, the economy, before public health.
Very well. Well, that, but of course, as always, we appreciate Barbara and Jim for their time this morning, and of course, for taking their time out to share their thoughts with us. This is an important topic because Donald Trump has made this about his public image. And as Barbara there said at the end, his priorities seem to be misplaced in some, arguments. Of course, we can make for that because he's worried about the stock exchange, but then others could argue, listen, you need a stable economy to be able to defeat the virus. Donald Trump has even spoken about opening the economy up completely by Easter, whether or not that happens or not, or is realistic or not, because we haven't even hit the peak yet in the U.S. That's, of course, still to be seen. Doctors right now do not have enough protective medical equipment or just protective equipment vis-a-vis masks and gowns, et cetera, to be able to even deal with coronavirus patients. And many of them are then contracting coronavirus as well on the front lines, and some of them are now in critical condition. Is this the best the U.S. can do, or is this just the best the U.S. can do right now under the Trump administration's leadership? Why wasn't there a reach out to partners and allies around the world earlier on, immediately? And why wasn't there quicker action on the part of the U.S. before Trump tried to score political points? Or was he not? Is he just somebody who's trying to do the best he can with the the cards he's been dealt? We'll, of course, keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.